In 1188, a historic gathering took place in the city of Leon in the Kingdom of Leon in Galicia. It was a kingdom-wide assembly convened by King Alfonso IX that brought together nobles, clergy, and town representatives to advise the crown. It is significant because it's the earliest documented European assembly to include urban representatives and to formally limit royal power in writing. Learn more about the Cortes of Leon and how it helped establish parliamentary government and representative decision-making on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by the Tourist Office of Spain. If you've been listening to this podcast long enough, you might think you know Spain. Well, think again. Spain is one of the most visited countries on Earth, with 94 million visitors every year. Many of those visitors will go to Barcelona and Madrid, both of which are great cities that I've been to several times each. However, there's so much more to the country than most people realize. Almost every corner of Spain is packed with history and culture. Extremadura in the west is home to fantastic Moorish architecture and ham and iberico, the world's greatest pork product. In the north, Galicia, Asturias, and the Basque Country have stunning coastlines, amazing food, and unique cultures. In the Atlantic, you can find the Canary Islands, where each island has a totally different geography and culture. In Catalonia, you can experience the Pyrenees Mountains, as well as fantastic art and food. The city of Merida has some of the greatest Roman ruins you'll find anywhere, and in Valencia, the home of paella, you can even find the Holy Grail. Spain is home to one of the best food scenes in the world, with a whopping 291 Michelin star restaurants, 16 of which have been given 3 stars. There is a good reason why so many people visit Spain and keep coming back every year. And I know because I've visited the country numerous times and have spent months exploring the country. If you've been to Spain and are considering returning, or if you've never been there and are considering going, you can learn more about all the great things to see and do at spain.info. Once again, that's spain.info. The Cortes of Leon in 1188 was a monumental milestone in the history of political institutions. While often overlooked in the English-speaking world, it's on a par with events such as the signing of the Magna Carta. The Cortes of Leon did not emerge in isolation. It was the product of a long and uneven evolution of collective decision-making institutions stretching from the ancient Mediterranean world through the political practices of late antiquity and into the early medieval kingdoms of Iberia. What makes the Cortes of Leon distinctive is not that it invented consultation or assemblies, but that it combined earlier traditions in a new way and formalized them in writing, explicitly including urban representatives as a recognized political estate. The earliest models of collective governance came from classical antiquity. In ancient Athens, the ecclesia allowed free male citizens to gather, debate, and vote directly on laws, wars, and policy. And this was democracy in its most literal sense. However, it was limited in scope, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners, and it was tied to a city-state rather than a territorial kingdom. Rome developed a different tradition. The Roman Republic balanced popular assemblies with elite institutions such as the Senate. While not democratic by modern standards, Rome embedded the idea that law derived from collective bodies and that authority could be constrained by established procedures. These classical systems left a powerful intellectual legacy even after their political forms eventually collapsed. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, governance in Europe shifted towards kingdoms supported by councils of elites. In the post-Roman kingdoms, including those that emerged in Iberia, rulers relied on assemblies of nobles and church leaders to advise on law and policy. In Visigothic Hispania, the councils of Toledo were particularly influential. These gatherings of bishops and nobles helped shape legislation, succession rules, and religious policy. They demonstrated that even strong kings required consensus from organized elites, but they did not represent the population at large. Participation was restricted to those with status derived from birth or ecclesiastical office. As Europe entered the High Middle Ages, new social and economic forces began to reshape political life. The growth of towns, trade, and monetized economies created urban communities that were neither part of the nobility nor the clergy, but increasingly essential to royal power. Kings depended on towns for taxes, loans, and administrative expertise. In response, towns sought charters granting privileges such as self-governance, market rights, and legal protections. Local councils, or consejos, became common across Iberia, allowing townsmen to manage their own affairs collectively. These institutions were not democratic in a modern sense, but they normalized the ideas of representation, election, and collective decision-making for ordinary free men. At the same time, monarchs across Europe were experimenting with broader consultative assemblies. Kings convened estates general gatherings composed of nobles and clergy to secure support for taxation or military campaigns. In some regions, towns were occasionally invited, usually when money was needed. These meetings, however, were typically ad hoc and informal. They lacked continuity and rarely produced binding written commitments from the crown. So when Alfonso IX ascended to the throne in 1188, at the age of just 17, he inherited a kingdom facing severe challenges. His father, Ferdinand II, had left the royal treasury depleted after years of military campaigns against both the Muslim territories to the south and rival Christian kingdoms. The young king needed to secure financial support and political legitimacy for his rule, particularly as he faced potential opposition from powerful noble families who questioned his authority. The political context of this period was characterized by ongoing tensions between the monarchy and nobility over questions of royal power and feudal obligations. The nobles of Leon had grown increasingly assertive about their rights and privileges, and the church wielded enormous influence over both spiritual and temporal matters. Alfonso IX recognized that he could not govern effectively without securing the cooperation of these powerful groups. But he also understood that the broader population, particularly the urban communities that were growing in importance, had grievances that needed to be addressed as well. This context explains why Alfonso IX took the unusual step of summoning representatives from cities alongside bishops and nobles to meet in Leon. These urban delegates, often referred to as ciudadanos or hombres buenos, were not nobles, but rather leading figures chosen by their towns. Their presence reflected the reality that royal finances increasingly depended upon urban taxes and commercial wealth. The inclusion of representatives from the towns and cities in the 1188 assembly was revolutionary for its time. These representatives, drawn from the bourgeoisie and common citizens of Leon's municipalities, sat alongside bishops, abbots, and nobles in what became known as the Curia Regia. This mixing of social classes in a formal governmental setting was virtually unprecedented in Western Europe, predating similar developments in England, France, and other kingdoms by several decades or centuries. The assembly produced a series of decrees known as the Decreta, or Carta Magna Leonisa, which established fundamental principles that would influence constitutional development for centuries. These decrees addressed multiple aspects of governance and justice. They established that the king would consult with bishops, nobles, and representatives of the people before making war or peace, a significant limitation on royal prerogative. The decree guaranteed the inviolability of homes, stating that royal officials could not just enter private dwellings without proper justification, an early articulation of what would later be recognized as a fundamental right to privacy and protection from arbitrary state power. The provisions also addressed judicial matters, establishing that justice should be administered fairly regardless of social status, and that individuals had the right to defend themselves according to the law. The assembly decreed that the king and his officials must respect the property rights of all subjects, and that taxation required consultation and consent. These principles reflected a sophisticated understanding of limited government and the rule of law that was far ahead of its time. The economic dimensions of the assembly were equally important. The growing towns of Leon had become centers of commerce and craft production, and their inhabitants sought protection for their economic activities and relief from arbitrary extractions by royal officials or local lords. The decrees addressed these concerns by establishing frameworks for commercial transactions and by limiting the king's ability to impose extraordinary taxes or seize property without due process. The immediate legacy of the 1188 Cortes was felt throughout the Kingdom of Leon and influenced political developments in neighboring Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. The practice of including urban representatives in royal councils became more common in Castile, Aragon, and eventually Portugal, though the specific forms and powers of these assemblies would vary. The principle that the monarch should govern in consultation with representatives of different social orders became embedded in the political culture of medieval Spain. However, the influences of the 1188 Cortes extended far beyond even the Iberian Peninsula. The ideas articulated at Leon about limited monarchy, consultation, and the protection of rights contributed to a broader European conversation about governance that culminated in various constitutional documents over subsequent centuries. When the English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, they were articulating similar principles about the limitation of royal power. However, the Magna Carta did not include representation from commoners as Leon had done 27 years earlier. The Spanish constitutional tradition that emerged from Leon in 1188 would influence Spain's political development through the medieval and early modern periods. The concept of the Cortes as an institution that represented different estates of the realm and placed limitations on the authority of the monarch became fundamental to Spanish political thought. Even as Spain moved towards greater centralization under the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella in the late 15th century, and as the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties concentrated power in the crown, the memory of the Cortes and the principles of consultation remained essential reference points in Spanish political discourse. The legacy of Leon in 1188 also had implications for the development of political institutions in the Americas. When Spanish colonizers established governance structures in the New World, they sometimes drew upon Iberian traditions of municipal representation and consultation. However, they were often implemented in ways that served colonial interests rather than protecting the rights of indigenous people or promoting genuine self-governance. In the broader sweep of history, the Cortes of Leon represents an important milestone in humanity's long struggle to establish systems of government based on consent, representation, and the rule of law rather than pure autocracy. While it wouldn't be accurate to claim that Alfonso IX and his advisors created modern democracy, they did articulate principles that would prove essential to democratic development. The idea that a ruler's power should be limited by law, that subjects have rights that must be respected, and that different groups in society deserve a voice in governance were radical in 1188 and remain foundational to constitutional governments around the world today. The 20th century brought renewed attention to the historical significance of the 1188 Cortes. Spanish historians and political scientists began to emphasize its importance as evidence of Spain's contribution to constitutional development and as a source of national pride. In 2013, UNESCO officially recognized the Decreta of Leon of 1188 and inscribed them in the Memory of the World Register, acknowledging their significance as documentary evidence of the earliest European parliamentary system known to have included representation of common people. This recognition sparked broader international awareness of the Leon Assembly and prompted comparative studies with other early parliamentary institutions. Scholars have debated whether Leon or other assemblies such as Iceland's Althing or various Germanic tribal councils can claim to be the first parliament. It's really a function of how you define parliament. The modern Icelandic parliament still calls itself the Althing and can trace its lineage back to the year 930. But it was a very different thing. It wasn't as representative, and it really wasn't even a governing body for a state. The Cortes of Leon also offers important lessons about the reality of political innovation. The assembly emerged not from abstract political philosophy, but from concrete needs and power struggles. Alfonso IX needed resources and legitimacy. Urban communities required protection for their growing economic power, and all parties recognized that cooperation might serve their interests better than conflict. It's also a reminder that rights and institutions often emerge from negotiation, compromise, and political reality, rather than from idealism alone. The Cortes of Leon and the Decreta of Leon aren't that well known, but they should be, because they are just as important as the Magna Carta in the evolution of modern systems of government. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. My big thanks go to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon. Your support helps make this podcast possible. And I also want to remind everyone about the community groups on Facebook and Discord. That's where everything happens that's outside the podcast, and links to those are available in the show notes. As always, if you leave a review on any major podcast app or in the above community groups, you too can have it read on the show.